Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Covenant Cast, where we discuss the past, present, and future of the tabletop gaming industry. I'm Zach.
And I'm Steven, and you guessed it, it's time for another entry into the Power 7 series. 7 mechanics that can be problematic or, depending on who you ask, very fun. Today we're talking to Isaac Vega about resource cards. This is the idea of resources in a deck or in a play space that you're drawing from, that you can get onto the board that gives you more resources later, that maybe lets you get more resources on the board to get you more resources later, etc. Of course, there's a million ways this mechanic has been implemented in games. Isaac is best known for his work probably on Dead of Winter, but also for all of us, Ashes: Rise of the Phoenixborn, and then now Ashes Reborn. And also started a new studio called Gauntlet that has recently put out a game or two, and I'm sure there's a lot more in the works. So we're going to talk to Isaac about the founding of that studio and also, of course, resource cards and whether or not they should exist in games. We hope you stay tuned. All right, well, as we said, we are here with Isaac Vega, one of our absolute favorites to talk to. Of course, started our awareness with Ashes: Rise of the Phoenixborn, and what I would consider a pretty genius system there. And then Isaac's gone on to found Rose Gauntlet, another publishing house that you're kind of running the show on, Isaac. So, hello, how are you? How are things on your end of the spectrum here?
I'm doing fantastic. Survived the last few years and still kicking and enjoying the process of still living in the tabletop industry. So yeah. I think that's all you can hope for and all you can ask for. And I'm still excited to go out to conventions and meet with people and still be part of this process. So I'm doing good. I'm doing good.
Well, I think a lot of our audience probably, knows you from Ashes, but I'd be curious, what's the Rose Gauntlet process been like? How's that whole thing, starting a publishing company and starting to make your own games? What have you done so far, and what's in the pipeline?
So we started off with our first project called Keystone North America. It's a card game in which you're going ahead and trying to create different sets of animals and create their own little ecosystems. And we have another game in the pipeline that's going to be our next game that we're calling Project Acorn right now. We haven't revealed the name quite yet.
Nice.
But that game is focused on foraging and kind of getting people to have a more passion around that subject matter. And we also have Life After Dungeon, which we've announced and working on that a lot. That's our big fantasy epic game that kind of goes more in the realm of things like I've done in the past, like Forgotten Waters and Dead of Winter and things like that. And we're also working on the side still a video game as well called Gone Gaia. And we have a few other projects that we have code names for on our website that people can check out at rosegauntlet.com. It's been fantastic. Me and Lindsay started the company about a year and a half ago now. It's been a lot of work, but it's certainly fueled like the next step in my design career. I kind of stepped away from Plaid Hat in order to have a new challenge. And I really feel like this has been been a challenge, but it's been fantastic and a wonderful learning experience. And I'm just excited at what I'm making right now, and I want to continue making amazing things. And what Rose Gauntlet Entertainment allows me to do is really explore more mediums than just one. And we're going to continue going down that path. I'm also working on a comic on the side too. So there's just so many different avenues that I can explore, and being at the helm lets me explore it in a little bit more of the direction that I want to.
Well, we certainly love to hear it. And if we just rewind the clock a little bit, now you have a ton of perspectives, like you said, the comics, the video games. So your perspective here is going to be particularly useful because when we first met you, one of the key things that you were talking about was Ashes: Rise of the Phoenixborn. And I will never forget kind of the initial pitch of this game, and one of the big factors, which was that it didn't have this idea of varying resources from turn to turn. I know you played some Magic in your life, and it was not hard to make the comparison to, like, wouldn't it be nice if there was a game where you just had all your resources at the start and you didn't have to rely on drawing them? So that's why we're talking to you today about the concept of resource cards. And we've had some hot takes from other designers along the way on their lightning round, kind of giving their take on whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing to have in a game. So just want to kind of kick it off here with, I know obviously you had some thoughts about resource cards when you went in to design Ashes for the first time. What did you see as the upsides and downsides of having this kind of draw your resources throughout the game mechanic? And why did you ultimately land on the dice system in Ashes?
So Ash's dice system really came out of my frustration in those early games, such as Magic the Gathering. I played a lot of Dragon Ball Z growing up. Got a little bit of Raw Deal, other things that were going on around then in my middle school and high school age. And my frustration was particularly with a lot of these card games. You would draw your hands and you'd either not have the resources you needed in order to execute what you wanted to do, or you would have too many of the resources and not have any of the cards in order to execute what you wanted to do. And with my design philosophy in Ashes is that I really wanted the character to be a powerful unit from the beginning. I wanted them to feel like they were prepared, and I wanted your deck to be able to do what it needed to do. Resources have a lot of cool advantages, such as like helping define how your character is, what they specialize in. I think Magic does an excellent job of kind of defining its different resource types and what they all have categories in. I'm sure other people may have different opinions on that. But I think they do a really interesting job, and it certainly was an appealing factor for me when I wanted to start playing that game. But the issue is that it's just, in the deck and may or may not show up. You don't really get to have a lot of customization sometimes on how you want to vary that up. If you want to have a very little amount of a resource, you don't know if it's going to show up in the 60 card deck that you're put together. So I wanted to be able to have a way to help define the character, to help add some variants, some ways to kind of be able to bring in the lore, the magic type, kind of help define the world a little bit, because I think resource types can do that, especially when you're playing around with magic and who you are as a character. But I didn't want players to feel like they couldn't execute what their deck was built to do. And that's kind of where I came with, how about we put it on the side? And how about we have this interesting dice system that also allows for the resources to have their own abilities and also define kind of play styles a little bit. So that's kind of why I went in that direction.
So putting your strictly like your philosophical design hat on, like, are you, we've seen Keyforge, like you think about Richard Garfield designing the system of Magic, and, so much development in that game that has happened to kind of try to patch what you're defining as the problems with having these like non-games where you draw all your resources or none. So we see Richard come back in with like a game like Keyforge or Soulforge, both of them having no resources really at all. In the game, we've seen modern games kind of get away from this idea that you have to draw into your mana or your land or your resources over time to kind of hit your cost curve, as it were. Is this just an outdated way of thinking about card games, or is there some kind of like redeeming value or interesting value in having this kind of resource play in your deck?
I think, like I said, it can help define the entire world that you're trying to bring together within the card game. I'm very much a designer that thinks about theme and how it's bringing to life the world and the characters that you're putting into this box, right? So I want players to feel that kind of stuff makes sense. And in certain games, that you may not need resource generation. I think Keyforge had a very interesting system when it was first introduced. I had issues with the way it was put together, but I thought the selection system was a really interesting system for sure. And games like Flesh and Blood, which you guys champion all the time, you have the option to choose between whether or not you want to use a card for resource management or being able to do that. And I just think it offers so many good decision points. Players can choose to whether or not how they want to define their character. They can have that build up. I think having some sort of resource management allows players to really get into the meat of making interesting decisions, because you kind of bring a cost to cards, right? So I don't necessarily think it's an outdated system. I think it can still have a lot of interesting decision points there, because as a designer that designs board games and card games, you always want to think about, how is this economy going to work? How are you going to go ahead and allow players to make those interesting decisions? What are they going to sacrifice in order to do that big thing, right? And resource generation and playing around with resources is a good way to do that in a lot of games. I mean, we have entire games in the tabletop world that are just devoted to accumulating resources, you know? So I certainly, and those aren't outdated. Those are some of the most highest selling tabletop games that exist. You know, there's a lot of ways that you can play around with them, but certainly I think they're not necessary to make an interesting game. There are plenty of card games that do an interesting job without them.
So I know our experience in tabletop is very focused, particularly around expandable games and expandable card games. If you really want to get down to it, right? TCGs, CCGs, LCGs, all the other things CGs that you call an LCG. Do you have, and you have a much broader experience, right? In board games, it's a huge category of different games and stuff. So I'm curious. You mentioned that this resource system isn't necessarily outdated, or it's not even necessarily wrong. There may be interesting use cases for it. What are some of your favorite examples and uses in games that you've either designed or played of resources in games?
Well, I certainly do really still appreciate Ashes, and I really appreciate the different decisions that Nick took in order to make some of those powers and changes in order to make those more balanced and refined. As far as I do appreciate the lands in some way in Magic. I just wish there was better consistency. There have been many of my own personal design attempts of trying to make that system a little bit better. Ashes was my answer at that time, but there's another card game that I'm working on right now that I'm trying to play around with, utilizing your life as the resource management system. As far as any others that kind of come to mind that I think are really interesting, I mentioned Keyforge. Keyforge does a really interesting job on how, when you're selecting what characters you're going to go ahead and utilize, it isn't quite the resource management system, right? Because you're just kind of choosing the faction. So I think it's a really interesting system on how that works. I don't know. I also play Digimon, which I think I mentioned to you guys back then. And that one's how that one works is that you're going to be utilizing so much memory, and then you actually push that memory over into your opponent's side. So you and your opponent are sharing how much you actually want to give to your other opponent, which I think is a really, really interesting system. And I would actually like to utilize it in other designs in the future. So there's certainly lots of things to pull from, but it all depends on what you're trying to execute, really.
Yeah. So on that note, let's just back it up a little bit. And talk about resources in games as a whole. So you've talked about these different systems that you like, and Digimon was a great example. Is that called the Chrono Clash system?
I'm not entirely sure. I know it's based on some other systems, but I can't quite remember which one it is.
And it is super cool where you the more you spend, the more your opponent gets to spend.
Right. Lord of the Rings TCG kind of has that going on.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings did that with Twilight tokens. Yeah. And the more you play, the more your opponent can kind of come after you. But okay, so when you're going into game design, I have to imagine that one of the most important things you need to kind of suss out at the beginning is how are things going to have a cost, and then how are those costs going to be paid, right? That's kind of the fundamental interesting decision-making process whenever, especially in a head-to-head game, is how are you going to manage your resources, and how are you going to do that better than me in a way that's going to allow you to win the game? And you said you're very theme forward, but I'm just kind of curious, what's the process of sitting down with that sketchbook in front of you and saying, okay, I'm going to design a game, and I know I want it to feel like X. And so here's what I'm going to do with resources. Like, how does that pop out? Is there some kind of magic elixir that you can run like your logic tree through to say, this is what the resource system should be?
Well, I try to look at, I like to do a lot of research, right? If I'm going to be bringing something into the world, I kind of want to play other games that are in the similar vein. I want to go ahead and make sure that I'm not just answering a question more poorly than another design has already done. And if I'm going to bring something into the world, I want to make sure it's interesting and new, and it's going to answer a lot of issues that people haven't addressed. I also design... theme is definitely something that's very important to me, but I also design out of frustration with something that I want to like and I don't necessarily like, or I haven't quite connected to yet. So I want to make sure that I can figure out a way that I'm going to go ahead and try to be able to be more connected to that style of game. So when I look to make a new product, I just try to figure out like what is correct to the theme and what is going to answer a problem that a lot of people are complaining about, either in that type of game or things that people haven't even thought of yet. Right. So I just kind of want to play around and tweak those things as much as I can before I kind of put it all together. That's what I do in my notebook. And then I play it in my mind over and over and over again, and then get it to the table and see if I actually did what I was hoping to execute. So those are the things I really kind of focus on.
Was the Ashes dice system, did that kind of go from I have this idea and it's perfect, or was there some development / evolution? Like, how did that all start in a certain place that was like, maybe we could have like these tokens on the side, and then was there any evolution there?
Ashes actually started with the dice system pretty early on.
I thought I might have.
I really hated. Obviously, I'd already mentioned it multiple times with the Magic resource management system, and I wanted people to be able to do what they could and come into this as a powerful wizard. But I did like the fact that you have sometimes you're stuck in random situations, and sometimes battle doesn't necessarily always go your way, and dice had a lot of drama to games. So I think that's something that I learned as I continued designing games. One of my most popular games, Dead of Winter, something that people always talk about in that game is like the terror of the exposure die that you have in that game, because pretty much every time you get exposed or you're going out into the elements, you roll this die and you could potentially just die, right? By going out there, a zombie could kill you. It's possible in that game, and dice add a lot of interesting drama. So yes, I rolled a whole bunch of commons. How am I going to get out of this situation? Right? And you have answers to that in Ashes. You're able to sacrifice cards in order to do so. But you can also come into rolling a lot of power symbols, and those allow you to do some interesting things, but then you have to sacrifice playing the cards that you wanted to play in order to do that. So I really liked that about the Ashes system, and as I continued developing it, there were lots of my friends who were very into Magic, Raw Deal, Dragon Ball Z, things like that, and they thought it would never work. I got a lot of negative stuff on the dice system right from the beginning, but Colby was a very big cheerleader of that system right from the beginning, and that kept going as we continue making iterations. I think at one point we only had 7 dice and it went up to 10. I think that was the only really big change, and I think we had 5 different dice types and we went down to 4. So I always knew that I wanted to expand that and make it up to the 7 that we ended up going with in the end.
That was there's something so fascinating that you said in there, which I think really gets to the heart of a lot of this series and really this question of resource cards, which is it's like the difference between drama and frustration. And like, does drama always have to have some amount of frustration possible in it? So like, for instance, a great example, when Zach and I come into a conversation about resource cards, I think our history is effectively skipped Magic because we were like just like always wanting to play the second tier games for whatever reason. We kind of started with Pokemon, and then we went right into things like Lord of the Rings TCG, Star Wars TCG, the stuff that was kind of like getting kicked off of the tables whenever the Magic players showed up. And that kind of formed an impression where we're like, we don't want to submit to Magic as the ultimate game. And so we kept playing weird other games. And one of those was Spoils, which was designed by, Magic Pro Tour folks, and they effectively had the Magic land system. You started with 2 land in play, but then you could put any card from your hand face down as a resource that didn't generate what they called threshold, which was like helping you, to actually unlock certain cards you could play, which seemed to us to be like a great solution. It solved a lot of the problems. But throughout these games where the resource cards are inherent in the system and the deck functioning well, Game of Thrones, the living card game, was a great example of this, of like, sometimes you got all of the things that smoothed out your curve and gave you a bunch of money, and you could play these big armies and you'd crush your opponent. And then sometimes they're all at the bottom of the deck and you were just getting hammered the whole time. And there's that element with resources floating around in a deck that can lead to those frustrating experiences where it's like, I can't do anything. But then some people would argue, and we've heard other designers argue, that there is that dramatic element to, I didn't draw the resource at the right time. How am I going to get out of, like you said, how am I going to get out of this situation? Or like, I have to make a consideration during deck building of how consistent am I going to be in having the resources versus having the cards to use those resources on it, and where am I going to find my risk balance on that? So what to you is the difference between creating drama in a game and creating frustration for players?
I think it all comes down to that, like, obviously with Magic, once you're very adept with the game, you have a good understanding, you're into it long term, you understand that is part of the process, right? You're building the deck, you understand that, sometimes you're going to draw poorly and that's going to happen, but you can go ahead and try to mitigate it through the deck building process. What I wanted to make sure was, how do I make that not an issue the first time people play, or the second time people play, when they're just starting off this process of understanding your game, and how do we go ahead and fix that so it isn't somebody's first impression, right? Because a lot of people may not know that if they're playing the game for the first time. They're like, I literally don't understand how to get out of this situation because I don't have enough information or know that it's going to get better, or if I would have made a different deck building decision, or maybe I didn't even build my deck, right? And that's another thing that we try to do in Ashes. It's not necessarily always for the deck builders, right? We provide a pre-built deck so they can go ahead and try that out for the first time. And we wanted to always feel like players had that decision, because even in games like Magic, you can say that, but when you're looking at your hand, it's like, I literally have something that costs 8 mana and I have 2 mana on the board and they aren't even the right color, right? So it's just like, can you really answer that question? Do you really have the option to deal with that? And I wanted to make sure that players actually had those options, and maybe they didn't know how to figure that out quite yet, but they're able to try to play around with the system and push the system in that moment, because you may only have that moment. And that's something that I've learned as a designer, especially in the tabletop industry, where people sometimes are less willing to take a chance on you long term. So you want to make sure that the first impression is a good impression.
Yeah, it sounds like the key differentiating factor between this kind of frustration and drama is, like, drama exists when the players know what's possible, right? Like when you know what the stakes are, and like in Arkham, for instance, Zach and I are playing Arkham. We know, it sounds very similar to Dead of Winter, that we can draw the auto fail token at any time, and like, that's just always a no. We go into the first session of the first game knowing that there's a rule that says if you draw this weird token, you will fail the test no matter what you do. Whereas in the example that you're saying with resource cards, there's an unknown reality when you first step into that game of saying, like, I don't even know that it's possible. I didn't know it was possible that I could just have a game where I don't get to play. Like that's not a risk I was expecting. So that becomes frustration rather than drama, like you're talking about. Is that a fair thing to say? Yeah, wicked. So you've given some good tips throughout. I don't necessarily know if there's a proper recap of this, but if there are other designers listening and they're thinking about the resource system of their game and they're thinking, you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to put resource cards in my deck because that's the way Magic did it, and that seems like a good way to do it. What advice or kind of warnings would you give those designers to say what they should or maybe should not be looking at?
Well, when it comes to design, I have learned you can do whatever you want. Experiment, have fun for sure. But I think the best advice is always try to get a good education as to what is already out there and what questions people have already answered, what issues people are already answering, and what is truly frustrating a large amount of players. When I sat down and created Ashes, I knew that I was answering a lot of frustrations that I had for myself. One with the resource management system, others with not being able to, have the first set of cards or having to mulligan over and over again. I created the first 5. And I also wanted to make sure that your wizard felt powerful right from the beginning and players had that feeling, right? And I also wanted to make sure that, you had more of a character, and I felt like Magic didn't really have a centralized character around the players, or they didn't really define who you were exactly. So I was answering those issues that I felt were an issue, and I also saw other people feeling that were an issue. And I also wanted to provide a game that had a lower price point and allowed players to have more ease kind of coming into the game than something that as overwhelming as Magic. There are lots of ways to answer those questions, and that's what can truly make a unique game. I can't necessarily give the silver bullet as to what is going to be the right answer, but certainly do your research and see what's out there and what people are how people are answering the issues that already exist, and can you do it in a different way? And don't feel like you're limited to just the normal type of things. I added dice to a competitive card game. You can do something else too. You don't have to just use cards.
So you mentioned a couple things there that I know are prominent, cornerstones of the Ashes design. I'm curious too. Another thing, there's a couple strings I'm picking up on. Another one was, you got a lot of negative feedback around the dice in Ashes. So, how often do you go into a design with these kind of cornerstone? It's first principles, right? It's like, these are the problems I'm trying to solve, and this is the way I want to solve it. But then you got that negativity, right? So how critical are those principles? And then how do you decide which voices to listen to?
Well, I really start thinking about, like, why are they saying those things? Because I think often with criticism, people necessarily don't know why they're saying the things, and it's the designer's job to figure out, okay, what's at the core of the reason that you feel this way, and how can I fix that issue, and does it still work into my design philosophy and my goals that I wanted to do when I was creating this game. When people were complaining about the dice system, is that they felt that there wasn't enough to mitigate or change the outcome. But then I was like, okay, well, the meditate system. You can go ahead and discard cards. You can go ahead and try to figure discard those cards. And how do we allow for more cards that utilize common abilities or a combo of common abilities in order for players to feel that they have good options, right? And part of it also in that time period was because they had only ever seen it done one way, right? So when people are used to kind of seeing things done a certain way, they expect that the only way to solve those problems are within the box that they've already been given. Sometimes you kind of have to push past that and understand that, hey, like, let me go ahead, even though maybe this group doesn't like it, let me go ahead and introduce it to another group and be willing to fail in front of multiple groups of people so you can kind of get a consensus of how an overall population might actually feel about that kind of thing. I think that people do, they do this thing where they start playtesting their products with only a small, very vocal group, and aren't willing to take it outside of that and actually see, how does the rest of the world feel about this? Or are these people just crazy? And I got so much good feedback outside of that early group that I was like, no, I think I'm still moving in the right direction. I still feel like people are engaged with this. And maybe my game, the way it is, isn't for them, but it is for these people. And trying to find your audience is a very big part of it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So you're here because of the Power 7, resource cards being one of them. And of course, being the name, the Power 7, you might imagine there are 6 other of these topics that we've identified that are, like resource cards, can be problematic or otherwise cause problems in games, particularly card games. So Isaac, I want you to put your card gamer, particularly even just as a player, hat on right now, which I know you've jammed a ton of card games in your life. I love that you played Raw Deal also, by the way. Zach and I played that on a throwback fairly recently.
Very small experience with Raw Deal, but my friends were super, super into it.
Yeah, that's kind of how it was for us too. It was like the chat was loving it, and Zach and I were like, "There's so much text. What am I supposed to do?"
What arena are we in?
Yeah, so
is it a Tuesday?
put your card gamer brain on, and let's go down these last 6. We're gonna do a kind of a lightning round here of what comes to mind and what you would think of X, Y, or Z mechanic in your experience, and how it is good or bad or different for a card game, and particularly a designer who might be considering the mechanic in their own kind of game. So let's start with one of the obvious ones, which is recursion, the ability to play cards from your discard pile. As a card gamer, when you hear the word recursion, what comes to mind for you?
Infinite loops and the possibility of infinite loops. I do like some recursion in card games. I enjoy it. Like a good example is that there's an entire color in Digimon that is very much about recursion and bringing cards back. But they do a good job of limiting it to very specific card types or group types. And I think that's where recursion needs to sit. It's okay as long as you have a very good understanding of where recursion's going to sit and that it's not going to evolve outside of that and completely break your game, because it totally can.
I will tell you, it seems like the forbidden fruit of all designers. So
oh, yeah.
We don't want to give it up fully, but I'm sure we can figure out how to make this okay, right?
So it's interesting that you bring it up, because the game that I'm working on right now, the card game that I'm working on, its entire thing is that you actually get to recur all of your cards, and you get to do it twice per game. So we'll see if it works out.
I love that. I wish people could see your face as you were saying that very sentence. One thing I will say to Ash's credit, even in the first version of it, and now particularly in Reborn, it does have recursion. One of the die types is actually recursion.
Yeah.
But that recursion comes at a cost of your health, and you only get so much of that. It's the same thing with once you can meditate and turn your dice any side you want for a certain amount of time, and then you run out of cards, which then means you run out of health. One thing I love about Ashes is it all comes back to the ultimate resource, which is your life total. You can discard, you can bring stuff, all the different stuff you can do, but that seems like the biggest restriction you can put on recursion is just make it cost you the thing that
loses you the
it
game.
loses you the game.
Exactly. Make that timer go down.
All right, moving on. We've got another topic for you here. We're calling this memory, sometimes the memory tax, but this is the idea of how much floating information should exist on the table at once. Particularly now, you're coming in this with board games too, right? So how do you find the scales on this to say this is too much tax on a player's memory versus this is not enough going on in a game?
Well, I definitely go from the angle of who is your target audience and how much are they truly going to be able to absorb. What is going on in your game, and how many levers can you have in front of a person before they start going crazy? In Ashes, we had specific battlefield limits. I knew that cards were going to stay out there with your spell board, so I knew players would have to have an understanding of how much was in front of them and how much they were going to be able to play with. And I didn't want that to get overwhelming, because I totally felt overwhelmed with some magic states sometimes and what players could do. So I think there's certainly a balance, but there's certain types of players that love that amount of chaos going on in the table space. I coming from a tabletop games designer as well, I also think about the physicality of how much space you're actually taking up on a table because of how many players and how much is going on around, and how much space that people actually have to play with. Some card games can definitely abuse your table space. So I like to stay in the realm of can a 14-year-old get their head around this? Because that's the target audience I try to go to, 14 and up. Right. And I want to make sure that people can kind of have a complete understanding of the game by not taking too much time to look at what's at your table. But some people love all of the extra stuff going on. They absolutely do. And I think there's certain audiences for that. And sometimes it's a good selling factor for those types of people. They want to be able to make tons and tons of decisions.
That's such a good point about just simply the amount of space a game takes up too. I hadn't even really factored that into the memory equation, but like that is a real consideration. You know, we told the story about Zach and I would get, booted off tables when the Magic tournament started. And it's like, that's a lot more likely to happen when you're taking up like 6 feet of space with your card game, right? Yeah. Right. So that's a really good point.
When it comes to card games, I like a card game can fit your cards in your deck can fit on an actual standard playing mat. If it can't, we have a problem.
Good, great advice for the ages there. Next mechanic. So this will tell me a lot about the kind of person that you are as well. So I like to ask it. What about the denial mechanics in games? And these are really defined as mechanics that are meant to stop your opponent from doing something instead of giving you a better shot at doing what you want to do.
I certainly love having them in the moments that I feel they're going to get me advantage in the game. But honestly, like I don't like too many of them. And one of my biggest regrets early on is actually designing reaction cards into Ashes. I felt that after seeing them in play, they can cause a lot of timing issues and they can cause a lot of feel bad moments that I didn't necessarily anticipate the more people abuse them. And I think in a lot of card games, they end up doing that. However, some people really like that type of gameplay. I think it's better to always kind of have things moving towards the end goal. And taking a hit is just something you kind of got to live with in life. So less being able to block stuff and more being able to take some hits, I think is a good thing for a lot of card games. But I understand why people do like them, and I understand why it sometimes feel amazing to be able to stop it.
So we have the official line on this is that Golden Veil should not exist. I think
I do think a lot of these, it feels like limits are important. And in Reborn, they made it where you get one reaction per turn, so it can't get unruly. But even
that's a good point.
Even on the Golden Veil, I mean, a touch of uncertainty goes a long way towards making it where a deck that can combo in some really weird way be unstoppable, you can't like count on it. So I don't know.
True. There's a little drama, as we say. I know the Golden Veil could happen, so a little drama there.
Yeah,
I go back.
I think it really becomes interesting when the player is actually forced to kind of like prepare for it. Like, I'm going to go ahead and take the risk to preemptively block something. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Does an interesting job of that sometimes with trap cards and things like that. They have reactions and stuff in the middle too, so it can go crazy there. But preparing for the eventual possibility of something, I think, is something that can create some interesting decision points as well.
I like that. Next up, we have the concept of what we're calling, and I think it's generally called, silver bullets, which are cards that are designed like to so specifically answer one problem that they kind of exist only to do that. Ashes is pretty good about not doing this, but we've seen like Decipher was really into this. Like, when we play the Star Wars CCG, it's like if your opponent controls Admiral Akbar and if there are 3 troopers on the board, here's this crazy effect. As a designer, like, what do you think of the value of silver bullets and whether or not they should be utilized when you're designing cards?
As a designer, I certainly understand the temptation of making them, especially when you see issues that you don't know how to solve in the meta. However, I think they should be avoided at all costs. Like
Nice.
you really don't want to make a card that's so situational that it has no value outside of that situation. And I just think it just kind of you're creating more trash in the world, which is already a bad thing. And you're just creating a situation where either players have to have it or they just completely ignore it. And I don't like cards like that. I want cards where they can go ahead and use in interesting ways and even surprise me as the designer sometimes. But if you create silver bullets like that are just like for specific situations, I think it's just bad design for the overall health of the game. But I understand the appeal. I understand the appeal for sure.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Moving on, we have something that we've talked to recently, we've seen recently in a lot of games, which is the idea of limit one per deck essentially as a balancing mechanic for a card game. It's like sometimes you'll see really powerful cards and it's limit one. You can only have one in the deck, and so when it's drawn, it has this big effect and it's crazy, but sometimes you draw it, sometimes you never see it in a game, right? So where do you think the idea of like limiting cards to lower quantities in the deck by design is the right call, or is it ever the right call?
Well, I think we certainly play around a lot with this in Ashes with conjurations, right? We have some spells that only summon one copy, and there can only ever be one copy of a conjuration in play. I think it can be interesting depending on the design space on how much you want to limit, but I don't necessarily like it when it's kind of never going to see gameplay again. It's just one thing and it's gone, right? At least in Ashes, if you have a conjuration that's limited to one card, you can bring it back once it dies. You can kind of continue summoning it over and over if you want to make that sacrifice. I tend to avoid it in my personal design. I understand why it can be thematic. It can add a lot of fun, and certain big points, but you don't want to design cards where if a player draws into them, and in Ashes it's very specific, first 5 you can start with things that are super powerful in your hand if you wanted to, so you don't want to make cards that are just too crazy, I feel. But at the same time, like, I can see certain situations where it would be interesting for them to come into play and interesting for them to work on a thematic level, but for the most part, I try to avoid them, and I understand why most people try to avoid them as well. Usually, they come into effect after the fact, such as like the meta is going out of control, and now we can only limit this card in one. And I don't like doing that either, because of the fact that now we're removing value from the players who've collected the appropriate amount of cards for their gameplay. So I don't like that either.
Yeah, a quick follow-up on that, because Limit 1 kind of brings this conversation to the fore of how fun or how high do you rate, like, what is effectively swinginess in a game? So, like, we've talked to some designers and some players who love that 1 out of every 10 games, like they put this crazy thing together and it works. And oh my gosh, and when it works, it's like so good and it's amazing. But then the other 9 games, they just lose. And so if you're on the receiving end of that 10th game where they put the thing together because all these random 3% chances add up, that doesn't feel great either. Like, sometimes you just get blown out by this crazy combo you didn't see coming. So, but there's obviously some kind of a line between, like, just operating a spreadsheet and then having randomness that's leading to different outcomes in a game. And sometimes you're a little stronger, sometimes you're a little weaker. What's your tolerance for swinginess in a game?
Personally, I like a good balance in between. I like that feeling of being able to pull something off that can only happen every once in a while in a very interesting way. But I also like consistency, especially in real life. It's very helpful. Gambling makes me very, very nervous, but gambling's addictive for a reason. There are ways in which swinginess creates high points that no other thing can. And I think that that's sometimes very great for a game. It can create some interesting drama and stories, and sometimes they're the most memorable moments, especially in card games. Like that's, I couldn't believe you pulled that off, or you drew that card, or you had that thing sitting at the top of your deck. Like there's so many interesting ways in which Swinginess can create some amazing drama and amazing storytelling, but you don't want so much of it that players can't anticipate how to come to the next game, you know, or try to answer those questions next time they sit down and play, because you want skill to play a factor. And I think when skill's no longer playing a factor, that's that is a huge problem with Swinginess. If the skill doesn't feel right.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And then finally, since this is the resource cards episode, we'll end with the resource focused sister of resource cards, which is the idea of free as a mechanic to implement on a card or on a design that is like one of the levers you can pull to like make it more interesting or make it more synergistic with other things in a deck. We call it free in quotation marks because I think of, nothing's full ever completely free. But I think of all the places we've seen games kind of go off the rails or metagames go off the rails is generally because they're getting something for less than it was supposed to be when the designer designed it. So what do you think of like discounting and reduction and free effects on cards and how you approach those in games?
Well, free was my first big mistake in Ashes, the Enchanted Violinist that didn't have a dice cost originally. Was the first errata we ever had to put out there and change up, and it created a lot of issues moving forward with the original 1.0 version of the game. I think when it comes to games that have a very defined resource system, you really have to start thinking, and this is something that I learned throughout the process of Ashes, you really have to start thinking about when you design a card, what is its effects value in the course of the game, and how do you cost that out appropriately, and if something has no value, why does it exist? Like if it has no value, it shouldn't be there. So it shouldn't be free, especially in games that are done well.
What a hilarious way to put that. I absolutely love that. It's like if you're costing out the cost of something and its value it provides, and it's not providing enough value to be costing anything, what are we doing? Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I try to avoid it.
Yeah, a lot of times this issue is not like printing free things as much as it's things that make other things free.
Yeah,
right?
sometimes that happens. I'm sure you've seen that in your Magic days and Yu-Gi-Oh! And everything else, right? That's discount. This thing's cost $6, but you play it for free if these things happen. It's like, what? How?
Which can feel exciting.
Yeah, there's some excitement there.
But it's just like recursion. It's like sometimes it feels cool.
Right.
Is there any moments like that, Isaac, that come to mind with free things or reduced things causing an issue in any given metagame or like, design talk that you've had? Aside from Violinist, I guess, is the obvious example.
As far, I can't think of anything that comes to mind, but I did play a game recently that I thought did a really interesting job in actually dealing with that, kind of possibility of things being reduced in value. Have you guys ever played Eclipse?
No, haven't.
So in that game, you have technologies that you're able to purchase and bring in, but you can go ahead and reduce the technologies based on how far up certain tracks you're on. But everything has a minimum value, which I think is a good way to kind of help mitigate making sure that players are always having to sacrifice just a little in order to get moving forward on that process, because those reductions can be huge. And I think, again, like, you just always have to think about, like, if this is going to have the possibility of being free, what type of advantage is that going to provide the players, and how is that going to create issues across the board? Everything has to have a sense of sacrifice in order for it to be worth it, I feel. And if you're creating too many situations in which you're allowing things to be free, it's going to create too much chaos in your game.
That's also very sensible. Isaac, it's been an absolute pleasure to catch up with you. Truly, I'll never forget like Ashes weekend and the great times we had, and hopefully
My first Gen Con, running into Ashes.
First Gen Con, so good. Hopefully more to come. Right now, if anybody's listening and they want to know more about what you're doing or where to follow you or your company, what is the ideal way that somebody would get hooked into your ecosystem?
We're at Rose Gauntlet on most social media platforms, and you can also go to our website, www.rosegauntlet.com, and contact with us directly there. I'm also Isaac on Earth on Twitter and Instagram, so you guys can follow me there as well.
Awesome, Isaac. Well, hey, thank you so much for taking the time, and we wish you all the luck and success in the future for you and the business you're running.
Thank you. I appreciate it.